I'm Dr. James Marcum. I'd like to welcome you back to Heart of Health. We're tackling a very difficult subject today, and the word, Steve, that we've talked about a lot so far has been planning.
Yes.
We want to plan because we don't want the loved ones to have these dangerous chemical reactions that sometimes cause from the grieving and stress of a funeral and everything that goes with it. And you know, when you think about your mom and dad and all this planning, it's hard to think about anyone not being there.
Yes, that's correct.
We're answering questions. The next question comes from Mary in Florida. And Mary asks us, if my loved one is cremated, and we're going to have to explain what cremation is, are there special arrangements that need to be made?
Right. Now, cremation is a form of disposition.
Now, what's disposition?
Disposition is when you leave the church after the service, theoretically you can take a right and make your way to the cemetery for burial, or take a left and the loved one can be taken to the crematory for the cremation process. So it is a final form of disposition, just such as burial.
Okay. Now, explain, you know, burials when we put, you know, our loved one in the ground.
Yes.
And then cremation, is that, you know?
There's a crematory.
Okay.
And the individual, during that process of cremation, when the cremation process is over, then the loved one is returned to the family.
Okay.
And a lot of times they will have a traditional service, and they'll place the remains in an urn and have a service at the church, or they may have a service at the church in a ceremonial casket and then go to the crematory at the end process.
Okay. Nowadays, there's lots of medical devices and things that are with patients. For instance, a defibrillator or a pacemaker.
Those have to be removed before the retort is what the device is called. The cremation takes place, and the pacemakers and things of that nature. We have a form, and we ask those questions, and if we're knowledgeable that those exist, then we need to remove those prior to the cremation process itself taking place.
So all that's got to be gone. Now, I had someone joking around in the office the other day. He's saying, well, you know, could I get one of those used ones and put those in? They don't use those again, do they?
Right, no.
What do you do with them? I mean, you know, if you have a pacemaker, what do you do with that pacemaker or a defibrillator?
Right, we just dispose of them.
Okay.
Just like anything else.
So it's a myth that there's a black market out there.
That's correct. That's correct, yes.
So Mary, I hope that there are some special arrangements.
There are some special arrangements. It's very important to understand this. If your mother passes away and your father is living, your father must sign a form to authorize cremation. If your father's already deceased and your mother passes away, then all of the children must sign a form authorizing cremation, because that's irreversible.
Okay.
And so everyone in the family, if the spouse is deceased, must sign the form authorizing cremation, or if the spouse is living, the spouse must sign a form stating that the cremation is authorized.
And now let's say I've planned this well ahead of time, okay?
Yes.
And I say, if I tell my family, I choose to be cremated.
Yes.
Now what if they say, you know, we're not going to do that? Can they do that?
They can. They can. What's so important about pre-planning is that you communicate your wishes to your loved one, your spouse, and your children, so that you don't surprise them. So it's very important that you do pre-plan and that you state in there that the cremation is your preference. But the spouse, if your spouse is living, she would have to acknowledge your request and sign authorizing us for the cremation to take place.
Now, I know you've probably had many families that haven't pre-planned.
Yes.
Have you ever seen family squabbles and fighting and even more stress because no one can agree with what needs to be done?
It is not often, but it does happen. And that's why communication is such an important part of planning. Once you plan as an individual, or even with your spouse together, both of you plan, it is important that you share those wishes with your children so that everybody's on the same page.
So it sounds like, you know, we're talking about the way you heal. And a lot of the way you heal is planning.
Correct.
And the second way is communicating.
Yes, sir.
So planning and communications are very important. Okay, let's move to another question. This question's from Hank, and he's writing from Alberta, Canada. He says, is a burial site needed before the funeral? Is a burial site needed before the funeral?
Well, that goes back to the concept of planning. It's highly recommended. Perhaps your family has cemetery property where your grandfather and your parents are buried, and then you're aware of that's going to be your cemetery, and perhaps you have cemetery spaces. If not, it is very important that you purchase cemetery property, if at all possible, in advance. Because, as I share with families, when we plan a wedding, people spend 6 months planning a wedding, and typically just a couple hours planning a funeral. And on the worst day of your life, when you've lost a loved one, coming to the funeral home and making arrangements is very difficult. having to go to a cemetery and starting at the beginning and deciding which cemetery and finding a grave space and all that is just extra emotions that could lead to the medical illness that you described earlier. So it's not absolutely required that you have a burial space, but it's highly advisable to plan ahead.
So if I chose to like put a loved one in the backyard, would that be acceptable?
Well, you have to have a special permit, depending on your state, which state you're that you reside in. But in city limits and everything, you have to have a special permit for that to take place, and it just depends on the variances in that community. Most families and loved ones nationwide are placed in a perpetual care cemetery.
Wow, this is very interesting. So the answer to Hank, at burial sites needed. This is very useful information that I don't think a lot of people think about or talk about. So the first things we want to do is we want to plan and communicate. We're going to take one more break and be right back.
2 words for you. Pop quiz. Ready? Name any funny movie. A drama. Name a mystery. And one more thing. Name the movie your kids saw today in science class.
Know what really matters. Know about your kid's school. And know about your kid. Find out 100 ways to know more, do more.
Our guest today on Heart of Health is Stephen Pike, and he helps healing in the end-of-life issues. And we've collected questions from all over the world, and we've had them sent in to heartwhitesministries.org. And if you have a question you'd like to send in for Steve or one of our other healthcare providers, send it into heartwhitesministries.org. Steve, you know, I write some prescriptions. I recommend treatments for families. You change chemistries, it sounds like, by writing the prescription of planning and the prescription of communication. But I don't see how you do it. I would be a basket case if I had all, you know, this going on at once. So I guess you know, your third generation, you must have a little bit of it in the genes.
Right, and you trust the Lord through the process. Every life is unique, every family is unique, and you just have to you just have to approach it in special ways and just try to help people. And it's a trust relationship. Communication, pre-planning are very important, but at the end of the day, it's all based on trust.
Well, you know, trust is a very important word because, you know, you think, you know, in this stressful situation, if you haven't planned ahead, you know, how would you know who to go to? It sounds like you actually have to do a little shopping and planning and choosing which funeral services, like you choose a doctor, you have to choose which funeral service you're on.
Yes, it's personal reputation, and you've previously served families. We've been here in Chattanooga, Tennessee for 75 years, and so we've had an opportunity to serve the community for some time.
Well, 75 years, that's pretty. Now, do you just have one site that you operate or multiple?
We have 4 locations, and we have 2 cemeteries and a crematory and a florist.
And how many people work with you, let's say, in the services?
We have about 40 full-time employees and about 25 part-time employees.
And do you train them in how to address?
Yes.
Do they go through some training too?
They go through extensive training so that we can be consistent and we can be compassionate and we can be informative, so that we can make this difficult time easier.
Well, you know, that's very interesting because I didn't realize there's so many people actually involved in the process. We got another question here. This is coming from Ned in Idaho, and I think this is a very interesting question Ned brings up. He says, can a family bury their own, or are there state and government regulations? Ned wants to know if one of his loved ones die, can he just not tell anyone and just put them anywhere they want?
Of course, their states, you know, vary. Idaho, Tennessee, there are different laws and regulations in each specific state. Generally speaking, the legal proof of death is a death certificate, and the death certificate is signed by the doctor and is certified by the health department. And you would just have to check into their regulations and policies. But there's not a law that I'm aware of specifically that would deny you the opportunity to handle your loved one's funeral. But most people want to rely on professionals that can help them, you know, in general terms, you know, handle this important.
So yeah, I didn't know that. You have to have a certified death certificate no matter where you die?
That's correct.
What if you're in a war or something like that? You still have to get the doctor to sign that?
Yes, you have to have a legal proof of death.
Okay, now it doesn't always have to be a doctor, does it?
Yes, it has to be a doctor. It has to sign it. The funeral director in our state, the funeral director does sign it in Tennessee, and the embalmer signs it. But now embalming is one thing your audience needs to know. Embalming is not a state law. You do not have to be embalmed.
Well, what is embalming?
Embalming is just the process that's been going on for centuries, by which the body is preserved so that you can have a viewing and a visitation and achieve closure.
Okay.
In the Orthodox Jewish community, they do not embalm, just as in Jesus' day, but the bodies are prepared. But most Protestants do select, embalming.
So Ned, I guess you have to check with your state and make sure you have a death certificate and go from there, right?
That's correct.
Now, is it required that they prepare the body in any certain way?
No, it's based on a religious preference.
So each one might do a little bit
Yes,
something.
if they select
Now,
non-embalming.
if you think about the history of the country, it always used to not be this way, did it?
Right. Well, in terms of embalming and
Or all of this. I mean, it seems like you see a movie or something, and they just sort of bury them themselves, and they don't go through all this process.
Right. Well, municipalities and the growth of the communities, and you have more laws and structures and rules and regulations. So that's true.
Now, I'm not going to ask you if you think that's good or not.
Right. Well, the most important thing, as I say, is peace of mind. And that's what individuals in my profession and calling, we really try to help families achieve peace of mind.
Steve, if we get 1 minute to talk to the world about the healing that you do, what would you tell people in need of healing? We talked about communication, planning, compassion, trust. What would you tell them that how you heal? What do you want to leave with people?
Well, the thing I would like to leave is really on the worst. You've lost a loved one or a child or a relative, and that is going to be the worst day of your life. And depend 100% on the Lord.
Okay.
And involve a minister. If you do not have a minister, then ask the funeral provider in your area if he could recommend a minister to help you through this process. But it's very important that someone pray with you before you have your first viewing and be there for the service and provide the eulogy. And the clergy is so important in this whole process. And the funeral professional that you select in that funeral home establishment, you must have trust in them, and you must feel like that they're carrying out a calling and that they really want to help you. But as I stated earlier in the program, the two most important aspects of a funeral ceremony is the role of the minister and the role of music. Okay. So be thinking about ministers and music, and plan ahead if that's possible. Plan ahead if at all possible.
Well, that's great. Well, I hope this has been very useful information here today. We want to thank Steve Pike for joining us today on Heart of Health.